So I'm talking about adaptation in a couple of different contexts and a few different scales rather than management per se. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we were trying to develop some adaptation pathways with the Tasmanian fishing industry. And then about some autonomous adaptations that we were able to describe in our industries. So to start off with, adaptation can happen at a number of different organisational scales, and you can have different adaptation targets. And I like this diagram from Miller that talks about the biological system and then the human system, and that we can have adaptation responses at any one of those scales. And we've been thinking about adaptation at global scales, at the whole of country, federal government level, in the high seas, which we talked about earlier this morning, regional fisheries at the local community level, and also with some conservation type approaches. And I'll just quickly go over some of those, except for that last one there, conservation, probably not that relevant for today. So just thinking about the global scale and how species on the move, particularly in this case, might intersect with some of the global strategies and goals that we have, and it's the Sustainable Development Goals that I'll talk about with this example. But with this paper here from 2007, with each one of these large shifts in distribution that we were able to document, we went through the Sustainable Development Goals. So we went through each target and sub-target in the Sustainable Development Goals and tried to identify where do shifting species distributions intersect with each of those targets and sub-targets. And as an example, taking no poverty as species change distribution, and those examples down the side there are from the numbers from the map, obviously changing access to resources, it changes distribution of pathogens and parasites, and that access to coastal areas is really important for vulnerable people in rural areas, for example. But what we were able to show is that species on the move intersects with every single one of those Sustainable Development Goals, but wasn't considered in any of them. So we have Sustainable Development Goals as this guiding strategy for our planet for 2030, and yet this global redistribution of species isn't factored into the Sustainable Development Goals at all. So very quick look at that global scale. Now if we switch to the country level, so the whole of country level, and the way that we went about that investigation for this one was to look at government level adaptation plans in countries that had parts of their EEZ in hotspots. So again, each one of those orange areas in the top 10% for rates of warming. So what we did was for each of those countries, we looked at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We looked at all the different websites. We also looked at the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. There were some adaptation plans up on that website, and we also sent individual emails to researchers all around the world that were working in those particular areas, and I'm sure none of them were actually wearing lab coats, and I keep meaning to change that picture. But to give you an example of what we found, so this is looking for the high-level, whole-of-government adaptation plans for marine biodiversity or fisheries in each of those hotspot countries. And what we found was that 12 of those countries had absolutely no mention of fisheries or biodiversity whatsoever. Around 11 had a national adaptation plan for all sectors, but only had a very minor mention of fisheries or marine biodiversity. Around 11 had a national adaptation plan that had specific actions for fisheries or biodiversity mentioned, but no action undertaken, so only recommended or planned at that stage. 2 had a national adaptation plan with specific actions for fisheries or marine biodiversity that had been undertaken. And there are only 3 countries in those hotspot regions that had a detailed sectoral plan for marine biodiversity or fisheries. And not surprising, they were UK, the US and Australia. So not many countries in the world that at that whole of government level, or I should say not many countries that are in hotspot fast changing regions, seem to have a whole of government plan for how to deal with climate change. So swapping to the high seas, and what we did there was we looked through the meeting reports of regional fisheries bodies in hotspot regions again for the last 14 years. These are just a list of the regional fisheries management organisations that were operational in those hotspot regions. There were 17 of them. Only 7 of those agencies or bodies had engaged in action on climate change, but the bulk of those actions were just internal to the regional fisheries management organisation. There were a couple of what I think we generously categorised as substantive actions, and they were just things like placing climate change permanently on the agenda for these regional fisheries management organisations. And there were, I think there was 1 or 2 examples where they had stated that climate change needed to be considered as part of the stock assessment process. But really, when you think about it, the regional fisheries board bodies are generally trying to, jostle for who gets the greatest allocation. And most of them are just sort of in this wait and see posture around climate change. And even though there are a large number of species in the high seas that are shifting quite substantially, there's not really a lot of action there on climate change. So we were sort of suggesting that in these fast warming hotspot regions, the management capacity of the regional fisheries bodies might not really be that fit for purpose in a warming world, and certainly not a lot of action yet that we were able to document from those meeting reports. So we've had a quick look at the whole whirlwind look at the whole of globe kind of strategy with the Sustainable Development Goals. Not a lot happening there. The country level national adaptation plans, and only a handful there, and then not a lot happening in the high seas either. So if we then take a look, scaling down to look at some regional fisheries in southeast Australia, and oddly enough in this description, southeast includes South Australia, which has got a very different set of oceanographic conditions and climate change exposures to these other states here. But there were, first of all, so the fisheries in southeast Australia are, as we were talking about yesterday, very low productivity. Lobsters is the main group by value and sardines by volume. Most of it is exported to Asia, and our fisheries are mostly output controlled. And we have some pretty strong forms of co-management. It varies fishery by fishery, but the 4 that I was dealing with in this study had very strong forms of co-management. So that interaction and the engagement with the stakeholders is critically important for these projects, and even for our funding. So we would suggest, a climate change project, and the industry has a very large say in whether or not that gets funded by our Fisheries Research Development Corporation. Also, as I mentioned yesterday, lots of participation in recreational fishing, boating, diving, so there's a lot of interest from the public in the marine system, and there's also a heap of conflict, so recreational fishers versus commercial fishers, particularly in some of the states in the southeast region there, and between fishers and conservation as well. So in that region in particular, and actually across the whole country, there's been a pretty coordinated climate change response. So we've had 2 key documents. One was the National Adaptation Research Plan for Marine Biodiversity and Resources, and another one was the National Climate Change Fisheries Action Plan. And I've conducted research under all of those, but led quite a number of large projects in what we call the Southeast Australia Program. So those yellow states there. Now the first thing, or one of the first studies that we undertook under that Southeast Australia program was a trait-based sensitivity assessment for climate change. And when we were asked to do this project, I really only undertook it because I was desperate for a job. I didn't actually think it would be that useful or used very much, but it's actually been used a fair bit by our industry, by the funders, and it's something that's been replicated around the coast of Australia. So we have a southeast version of this, a Western Australia, and a Northern Australia version as well. But we were able to identify or to suggest in this what species might be at higher sensitivity to climate change, and we were categorising them as either at risk of range contraction or range extension as well, those different coloured bars there. But we took the results from that, or not we actually, the funders took the results from that sensitivity assessment and then used that to prioritise which fisheries species would then go on to more detailed adaptation plans. And those were abalone, southern rock lobster and blue grenadier, which were all designated at high risk or high sensitivity to climate change, and then snapper. And they chose this suite of 4 fisheries species and industries to try and get a range of examples. They wanted us to try and identify what the widest range of potential adaptation responses would be for our region, and to try and have different examples of, like snapper is seen as something that's a potential win, for example, whereas the other industries were at a higher risk. So they were trying to put a suite of species together that might exhibit different responses and had different styles of industry. And it was, for us, it was a pretty big project. It was a big part of my life for about 3 years. There were around 40 scientists and around 30 different managers and fishers in the project. So we did get a lot of interest and buy-in from the industry. So to start off with, we looked at where climate change intersected with various components and levels of the fishery management system. So we looked at the stock assessment and the harvest strategy and the operational framework. We then looked at the broader management plan, things like compliance and enforcement, property rights, and then the fisheries government system. And at each one of those levels, we were trying to identify where climate change might intersect, what levers there might be to pull, and what might be the barriers to action in each of those. And it was an enormous number of workshops and surveys and meetings, because we really did try and get a lot of interest, and it was a very participatory process with the industry. So in terms of developing the adaptation pathways, and the detail here is probably not important, but just that we had a process of scenario development around what were the key effects of climate change on each fishery, and how, this bit's important, how climate change fitted in a broad industry relevant context. So we really tried with the industry to put ourselves in their position, if you like, and try and understand where climate change fitted with the suite of other things that they were much more concerned about. And then there was a process of developing what the adaptation options might be. And the only important bit about this diagram really is that there's industry input into almost every one of those levels. So when it came to developing the adaptation options, we had science teams doing the science part of it, but we also had a lot of industry and management input into these potential adaptation responses as well. And that industry perception, that industry involvement was critically important, because their perceptions of climate change at the time were, so we'd have these workshops and they would just say, climate change is crap, you're making it up because you want the money. And I think it was only around 20% of them that identified or thought that climate change was happening, or maybe something's up. But 80% of them really didn't think climate change existed. But we think that there's been a complete flip in that. So we had an honours student a couple of years ago that went and surveyed the industry again with some interviews, and it seemed completely reversed. And I think there's, I have got a slide, I'm not sure where it is, but I think there's a couple of reasons for this complete change, and that's been that we've had quite a few big shocks and changes in the industry there in Tasmania.
Sorry, it's just on that. Do you think it's the shocks or the engagement process?
We actually think it was both, because that study where the honours student went out and interviewed people in the community, managers and industry participants, she wasn't allowed to mention a particular citizen science project that I run around Australia that's been very active in communicating and engaging on climate change across the east coast of Tasmania. So she would interview people, she found out what their perceptions were. A lot of those were mentioning RedMap, the citizen science project that I run, and others she'd get to the end, and if they hadn't mentioned it, she was then allowed to mention, were you aware of this citizen science project? And the ones that acknowledged climate change all knew of the existence of this project and said they got information about climate change from that project. So I don't think it's conclusive, but we think that a lot of our engagement has led to a change of perception.
Sorry, just one question. The shocks, as well, the shocks, this is shocks to the fishing industry?
I have got a slide, because I haven't slept for 3 days. I'm not exactly sure where it is in the order of things, but there's definitely a slide in there.
How close those shocks were to home?
Yes, yeah, well, we'll go into that. But basically that diagram I showed you earlier of the developing the scenarios and then the adaptation responses was part of trying to get at adaptation options and barriers from both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, rather than just being the scientists swanning in and saying we think you should do this. We were trying to get their input and perspectives as well. So we had that science-based approach of trying to get the adaptation options, and then a bottom-up approach where we gave them the climate change scenarios, which we developed with their input as well, and said, okay, what if change X happened in either distribution, abundance, or whatever the change might have been, what would you just automatically do? What would be the autonomous adaptation that you would do? So by autonomous, we mean an adaptation response where you don't need the input from management or government. And then we said, okay, what would you like to do, but you can't because there's a barrier in the way? So this was how we generated the autonomous and the planned adaptations. And then we also had a high-level socio-economic risk analysis, and then a governance benchmarking exercise as well that went through other parts of the fishery system. And when we were developing these adaptation options, we were asking them to think in short term through to the long term. So some of these short-term responses that might help with coping, and then some of the more outlandish, transformative kind of options as well. So we were really trying to push them to think a bit outside the square. And so we were saying, we presented this to them and said, you know, there might be some options that are rational, some that are efficient, and some that are appealing, and it's this sweet spot here that we're trying to get adaptation options, ones that are rational, they're appealing, and they're efficient. But to keep in mind that as climate change progresses, what fits into that sweet spot might be very different in 5, 10, 20 years from now. So things like, an example there would be translocation from one area to another. That might have been prohibitive 10 years ago, but they're actually doing that now. The other thing that we went through was we developed we talked about goalposts for adaptation. So often when people talk about adaptation, they're trying to make things less shit, rather than having a specific goal in mind. So what we did was we went through a process, again with our managers and our stakeholders, and we're trying to identify what the weighted objectives were for the fishery. So, we had maximising wellbeing of communities, maximising the economic performance, ensuring environmental and ecosystem values, and strengthening the management and governance. They're from the existing fisheries management plan, but they'd never been weighted, and there are a whole lot of sub-objectives under those that, again, had never really been prioritised. And what we did with each industry and each group of stakeholders was to get them to weight those with the aim of, when we're developing the adaptation options, we can see how they trade off against each of those objectives, and then knowing what the weighted preferences were of the different stakeholder groups, we could see where there might be potential for conflict. We also, for each adaptation option, characterised them in a number of ways. So the obvious one there is, was it autonomous, is it incremental, is it transformational? But we also asked them to tell us what the scale of implementation was. So some adaptation options might be very specific to one state, they might apply to all the states, there might be differences between the states. Some things might have a very long lead time to implementation, other things might be stuff that they can do in an instant. There might be a cost. This one was really critical, so who paid? The industry wanted to know, well, is that going to be our cost? Is that going to be the manager's cost? They wanted to know how the cost of these things would be allocated. And also the benefits. So when we have an adaptation option, it could benefit the individual fishers, or it might be something that actually benefits the stock or the ecosystem. So we're really trying to just pass out in as many ways as possible what types of adaptations are they, and how might they have differential benefits. So the other thing was, so we generated this whole long list of adaptation options, but obviously they will have different benefits and risks and feasibility. So that's exactly what we asked the industry and the managers and the researchers to go through each one of those adaptation options and rank them according to feasibility, risk and expected benefits. And there were things like, for expected benefits, what's the benefit to the wider ecosystem? What's the benefit to fisher profit? Risk would be things like, is there a likelihood of reduced employment? What's the risk of not having a social licence to operate? All those kinds of different factors. And the point of doing that was, obviously, you might want to test your options in a management strategy evaluation framework, but there's no point doing that if you're suggesting adaptation options that the industry in a co-managed system don't want. So we were trying to come up with a screening process to identify what might be the useful suite of things to suggest for formal management strategy evaluation. And this is the kind of data that we got out of that process. So this is feasibility along the bottom and benefit there. And then the adaptation options that we would suggest you might want to put forward for formal management strategy evaluation would be ones up here with a small circle. So the size of the circle denotes the risk. And so we'd be after potential strategies or options that had high feasibility, high benefit and a small risk. So this was sort of how we presented it to the industry, and they really liked this because it was visual and they could go, okay, we're after things up in that corner. I just wanted to throw in a note that adaptation for fisheries isn't just about the harvest sector. So there's a whole lot that happens after the harvest sector, and that our fisheries need to be robust across that whole supply chain. So Eva Plagani, as part of another project under one of those funding plans that I showed you earlier, developed a qualitative metric to identify critical elements in the seafood supply chain that might be vulnerable to climate change. And I'd encourage you to look at that paper because I think it's underrated and very useful. So we did have quite a few challenges and barriers to adaptation. One, this was the key one, divergent expectations to this research. So we were funded by the Fisheries Research Development Corporation. Their instructions were, we want concrete adaptation options implemented out of this. The industry said, we just want to know what's going on and what's going to happen in the future and what sorts of things we might need to think about. The managers were, don't tell us what to do over my, don't tell me what to do, we just want to know what we might need to think about. So there were very different expectations in terms of the funder and the managers. We did get a lot of interest from stakeholders, but there were some people that came to 10, 12 different workshops. So the potential for stakeholder burnout there was pretty high. We still managed to get interest and to get people to come along, but there's no way we could have run another project like this straight afterwards, for example. We needed to give them a bit of time to chill. And I guess because we're a small state, there's a limited number of people that we can call on to do this. And consistency is great. You do want the same people that are familiar with what you're doing to come along, but we just can't ask too much of them. There was a very big fear about the increased costs of adaptation, so we were just trying to be really clear about climate change is going to affect all these industries. You will be on the front foot if you're participating in this kind of research and becoming aware of these kinds of issues. And the last one there, the time for this interdisciplinary participatory kind of research was pretty huge. Some of the people in this project were academics, and like myself, that didn't have job security at the time, and the other half were fisheries agency employees. And so there was a different implications for the amount of time that we invest in this sort of project, and that was something that I think we needed to think about. So after we'd done all that work, that finished in about 2014, we then had a number of significant events. So this is the slide that Stephen, you were interested in, I think. So we had, in 2015, we had a marine heat wave that lasted for 251 days. So it was a very significant event. We had mortality of wild abalone and of rock lobster. We had a paralytic shellfish toxin. There was a global recall of a lot of products, very big economic losses. And then we also had a new strain of Pacific oyster mortality syndrome as well. So some of our range-shifting species are these new diseases popping up that are affecting aquaculture and our wild catch industries. So there were a couple of aquaculture industries, in particular for the POMS disease, that nearly went broke. So it was a big shock and a big wake-up call, I think, for people in the industry. But after these kinds of events, a group of us got together and we wondered what had been the response in the industry to these changes. So we were looking for autonomous adaptations. What were the kinds of things that had been undertaken by the industry without any management action? So we started collating a list of all the autonomous adaptations that we were aware of. We looked at the diving sector, recreational fishers, commercial fishers, charter operators, and different aquaculture industries. And what we found was a stack of autonomous adaptation actions that were being undertaken. So we had charter operators advertising for new trips. There were a lot of changes to product and handling and landing practices that the managers were not aware were being undertaken and what were happening. Lots of changing to farming practices and quite a few examples of using seasonal forecasting for farm management. So the individuals and the communities were adjusting their behaviour much more readily than I think than our rigid or relatively rigid government and management structures. When we took that list of adaptation options and said, well, what kind of, how would you categorise those? This is a formal typology by Biagini that looked at the different characteristics for adaptations, and those ones in orange are the key ones that we had. So there was capacity building, practice change, information, warning or observing systems, and new technologies being developed, all without any formal management intervention. But here's the kicker, half the autonomous adaptations were potentially countervailing to the kinds of planned adaptation that we might expect from the government. So we were very strongly suggesting with this work that our governments and our managers need to be aware of what kind of autonomous changes are occurring so that we can make sure they're on the right adaptation pathway and they're not heading down any, into maladaptation. So to give you an example of some of them, this is the adaptation behaviour, that's the primary actor, the potential outcome, and then the potential interactions with planned adaptation. And in terms of the potential outcome, we were looking against the exposure sensitivity adaptive capacity framework. And as an example, just with the divers, so there weren't any hardcore adaptations with the diving group, but just as an example, they were requesting a lot of information and presentations on climate change. They wanted to know what was occurring with giant kelp loss, for example. And so we were suggesting that divers might be more accepting of planned adaptations down the track. If we go to the rock lobster industry, they were unloading in cooler waters. So they were actually using, or are still using, a lot of fuel to go to another port that I think is like 150 k's further south. So they'd shifted where they were unloading to avoid warmer waters because it had significant mortality in the holding tanks. And so that's a potential biosecurity risk. So the managers had no idea that a large part of the fleet were making these large movements to different ports to unload the stock. And in another example there were charter operators that were advertising fishing trips for new species that were turning up in Tasmania. And the management plans to manage fishing effort might then be affected by that. Now, one of the ways that we were trying to think, okay, what kind of research can we do that facilitates this autonomous adaptation by the industry? And so one of the examples of that is from Curtis Champion, who you'll hear from at 2 o'clock today. And he was looking at habitat suitability modelling for one of these new species. This is the one that charter operators were advertising for new fishing trips. And he was looking at 5-year bins for habitat suitability and how the fishing opportunity in Tasmania, this is Tasmania here, how this increasing fishing opportunity might change over a couple of years. And so this was very well received by the fishing industry. They liked the smaller timescales relevant to their operations. So you could imagine a 5-year window would be the window that you would think about potentially buying a new boat, for example. The last thing that I wanted to mention really is that some implications of climate change just can't be adapted to. And we have quite a few examples of that from our Tasmanian Indigenous community. So one of the species that is critically important to them is this rainbow kelp shell. So it's a fished species, but in an Indigenous context. This rainbow kelp shell is associated with our kelp habitats. The kelp is declining, that's a climate change effect. The rainbow kelp shells are virtually disappearing. And it's through that shell that the Tasmanian Indigenous women experience a lot of their connection to sea country. So that's a really big impact that we're having that there isn't a response to. You can't swap that species out with something else like we can in a Western context. So just in summary, adaptation to climate change I think is pretty complicated and messy. We have that limited planned adaptation action. There's a very low awareness of non-governmental adaptations, and I'd be pretty confident saying that I think that would be a widespread issue. It's multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, lots of competing values and interests like we've all been talking about so far. Lots of winners and losers and trade-offs, and lots of value-based decisions. So I think the technical aspects are half the battle, maybe not even half the battle. The big issue, as we've been talking about, is this the allocation of resources and the trade-offs. And I think that was all I had. Thank you.
Okay, I've rejected
Oh, I've got still got the microphone on.
I've rejected this. Anyway, seems dead. Is it on?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. Okay, so questions for Jeff? Not surprising.
That's a great presentation, thank you. Question just about the autonomous adaptations, which I find really fascinating. Because how many? I don't really know how to ask the question. To what extent is that adaptation, are they short-term adaptations, or are they future-proofing their response after a short-term event?
Both. So, for example, one of the larger adaptations was with that Pacific oyster mortality syndrome. A lot of the industries, a lot of the individual farmers got together and literally protested the government for some funding for a test kit. And so that was developed, and instead of having to send samples away to the mainland in Australia and waiting 2 weeks to get an indication of whether they can sell their stock or not, they can find out instantly with these new test kits. So I think that's one example of where the industry was really self-motivated to try and make a relatively big change. There's a bit of, I'm trying to think, we have got some genetic selective breeding stuff happening, and I'm not sure if that was an example as well, I can't remember.
What I have in my head is you said that they were potentially going off the path of the sort of government route. Maybe they're not. What they're doing is just making those shorter steps, but then it might be a wiggling pathway, but over that longer term, as they're receptive to the messages, they will be on the same path over the longer term.
In most cases, I think, but for our salmon aquaculture industry, for example, they're bedding down in areas that I don't think will support salmon aquaculture into the future. So they're, investing in bigger and better facilities, but I don't think that's a great long-term strategy.
That's relevant to the national adaptation report that they're preparing for aquaculture, that type of example.
I can send you that. It's in review, but I can send you that paper if you like.
Okay, another question. Alan and Tom.
Do you think, I mean, like this, do you think that there are a lot of people in the industry who are sort of trying to protect private information about new economic opportunities? I mean, I feel like one element here of, trying to have cooperation is that, people want to keep secrets. That's a part of what they do.
I've got an example from the recreational sector, but not the commercial. I'm sure they exist in the commercial sector, but the example that we've got is with the recreational fishers. There's two main new species that we've got: yellowtail kingfish and snapper. And I cannot for the life of me figure out why this is, but the yellowtail kingfish fishers are plastering it all over social media, and the snapper fishers have gone hunkered down and gone secret squirrel. And the efforts that we've got to go to and the things that we have to promise never to tell anyone to get to these fishing sites to get our samples, and we're trying to do acoustic tracking and tagging at the moment with these new snapper coming into the area, and we've got to basically promise to sell our firstborn child if we accidentally let this information slip. So it's, I don't know why, similar kinds of species, but one's very, very secret and one's I caught. So yeah, it's very different.
Okay, Tom.
Thank you. That was great. A really good presentation. It was a lot to take in. Early on, you talked about the fraction of the stakeholders who were engaged and probably at that point receptive to taking adaptive measures for potential climate variation.
Yeah.
I guess what I was thinking is, is there any way to track the those who were sort of receptive versus non-receptive early on, and who actually was engaged in the adaptive measure, the adaptive process, and whether there's
I
a
wish there
relationship.
was, but I
Yeah.
don't think we do. But that was extremely interesting. The whole, like we'd done this big survey, and it came back with 80% of them thought we were just making it all up. And then when we got a workshop with those same people in the room, and we kind of went, okay, let's just park the whole climate change thing. We don't worry about that for a while, but just tell us what kind of changes you're seeing in the environment. And they had a list as long as your arm of all these things that were entirely consistent with climate change, but they just didn't see it in that way. And we could actually see in the room people kind of going, oh yeah, I saw that. Oh, did you see that? Oh yeah, oh okay. Like there was kind of a bit of a gelling in the room of them kind of going, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's a lot going on. And Ingrid Van Puten's got a study out that I was involved in looking at attribution and cognitive dissonance, and one thing that we found was that if a climate change effect was a positive one, people were happy to say that it was climate change. If it was a negative impact, then they would blame anything else, management, it's whatever, but it was just they didn't want to accept negative climate change implications, which I thought was really fascinating as well.